Stay there a minute.
More people are going to land their dream wildlife job in the next few years than they have in all of human history. Wildlife vacancies are as competitive as show business. But if you do what other wildlife professionals do, you eventually get the job. The Practical Animal Channel is a platform for interviews for ambitious naturalists. It documents professional wildlife workers' rise to success, providing a career roadmap. Watch this video for an excellent summary of what it takes to be a biologist working with tarsiers, a group of small nocturnal primates native to Southeast Asia. So, if career success for you means tarsiers, how do you get there? Dr. Myron Shekelle is an American anthropologist and a leading expert on the evolution, ecology, and conservation of tarsiers. For over 30 years, Shekelle has lived and worked in Southeast Asia, researching and teaching in Indonesia, Singapore, and Korea. He earned his BA from the University of California, Los Angeles, and his MA and PhD from Washington University. His dissertation focused on tarsier taxonomy and biogeography. He and his teams have described multiple new species, demonstrating that the single or two species once recognized actually comprise a cluster of 16 or more. Shekelle's work extends beyond academic research to actively promoting conservation and an equitable approach to primatology. If you're learning English as a second language, this video will be useful because you will hear two accents, a British and an American one. And before we go any further, I would like to say thank you to my subscribers. Without you, there would be no channel. Working in wildlife conservation and living the wildlife looks like this.
What jobs are there with tarsiers in the wild or in captivity?
You pretty much have to make your own job for that, unless by chance you live in a habitat country like Indonesia or the Philippines, Malaysia, or Brunei.
Could you perhaps expand on that? How might somebody create their own job?
Oh, sure, it happens all the time. So, for instance, I think, I don't know if this is surprising to people, but in my experience, some of the best conservation gets done by dedicated individuals.
Myron, what do you do?
So I'm a senior instructor here at Western Washington University in Bellingham, Washington. That means I'm a teacher. But one of the things that's important is that a big difference between a science teacher in high school versus a science teacher in college is that we're expected typically to have a PhD, and we're expected, therefore, to have done research. And so we're really professional researchers, not professional teachers. Our high school teachers often have more training in teaching than we do by a lot. And so the advantage, if we bring anything in here, and here's the little catchphrase, it's research that informs and inspires teaching. So when we stand in front of a classroom of students, we're typically standing there as an expert in some very small section of the world of science.
How did your career develop?
Well, it developed very organically, I would say. I have noticed that there's on a spectrum. At the opposite ends of spectrum, there are people who are very goal directed, and they may know very early in life what it is that they wanted to do, what they expected to do. And then there's other people that are very flow directed, and they tend to follow with the flow. Behind me there, you can see a picture of Jane Goodall. Jane Goodall, the story is that she was very goal directed, and that she knew very early on that she wanted to work with animals. And I have other colleagues like this who knew at 7 or 8 years old. They might have even picked the animal that they want to work on. For me, it was nothing like that. I was very flow directed, and I was just following opportunities that were suggested to me by my mentors within academia.
Myron, what is the protocol for approaching wild tarsiers during your researches?
So that's changed a lot since I began. And in the beginning, I would say that there was a lot less care taken for a number of potential problems, like what we call now zoonotic transmission. Um, and so the idea that I could be transmitting a disease to the animal, or the animal could be transmitting a disease to me. There wasn't as much care for that in the past. And so nowadays it's much more common to do the work almost as like a nurse or a medical doctor might do, perhaps wearing a mask and gloves and things like that. So I would, imagine nowadays that you want to spend a lot more time reading there are books on this subject, and then for your own specific animal that you happen to be a specialist in. So tarsiers are small, but they have a really wicked bite, and I have been bitten by tarsiers several times. Some of my colleagues will wear really thick gloves when they're handling tarsiers. And then they bite the leather glove. But I find that I don't have that tactile sense of, how much pressure is the right amount to restrain the tarsier and how much is too much. So I haven't liked the big gloves, and I risk my hands a little bit more. But that's one thing to watch out for. Another thing too is bats. If you catch tarsiers, are often caught in mist nets. The whole story of how the development of tarsier field biology, it all came from an ornithologist who was working on the island of Borneo in the 1960s. And he went to study birds that ate insects. And so he thought if he set his mist nets up underneath large fruiting trees that had dropped the fruit, that might be a good place to catch them. And so there he was, ready to catch all these birds. And what should happen but a tarsier jumps into the net. Now, at that point, I don't think anybody had ever collected data on wild tarsiers through trap and release. They were just trapped to be taken into a zoo and brought back to wherever they were going. I don't think anybody had ever done trap and release at that point. So, a tarsier gets in, it's probably bouncing around. You're never going to catch a bird like that. So you get it and you let it go. And at some point, he realized that he had more data on wild tarsiers than anybody had ever had. And so they've got these ankles kind of like a bird. You know, bird's knee almost looks like it goes backwards, but in fact, it's not. Its knee going backwards. It's actually got a really, really long ankle with an extra segment. And so when they trap a bird, they put a little metal ring around that segment of the bird's leg. Well, the tarsier has one of those too. And he had all the rings there. He was an ornithologist. And so he put one of those around there. And so he found that these mist nets, which were set up for birds, would capture lots of tarsiers. But the point that I want to make here is that they also catch a lot of bats. And so in the old days when I first started this, I would probably catch 4 bats for every tarsier. So if I've caught 100 or 150 tarsiers, that means I've caught 400, 500 bats. And bats also have a wicked bite, and bats also, at least in many countries, can carry rabies. Now, when I first went to Sulawesi, it was considered almost rabies free, but that's not the case anymore. In any event, I definitely began the prophylaxis for rabies before I began this work, because rabies is not a disease that you want to suddenly discover you've been exposed to.
What skills do professionals working with wild tarsiers need, Myron?
Okay, so there you go, right away, mist netting. And I mean, a mist net, you think, okay, well, I'll, learn how to, catch the birds. The first thing is just how to open a mist net and set it up without letting it drag in amongst the dry leaf litter, because nets are designed to catch things. And just the dry leaf will foul your nets as badly as anything else. So when I first began, it took quite a bit of time just to learn how to get a net out of a bag and to set it up, and then to take it back down again, get it back into its bag. Um, so there's a learning curve there with just learning something like the mist nets. And then all the rest of the tools like that the ornithologist has. People go out there with ankle rings. And another thing is what you're doing and why you're doing it. The people who are studying behavior will then attach small radio telemetry equipment so they can follow them at night. Although that's becoming less necessary now with infrared and particularly thermal cameras. You can now get a thermal camera that attaches to your iPhone, and boy, that just makes everything light up at night. Because remember, let's say you think, oh, I'll use infrared. This will be perfect. Okay, go out in the forest right today during daytime and try and pick out an animal the size of a small rodent. It can easily hide, right? You might not see it in broad daylight. So just because you've got infrared doesn't mean that you can see an animal this big hiding somewhere in the bushes and leaves any more than you could during the daytime. The thermal, on the other hand, that really makes them leap out. So with those two things working in tandem, the thermal will find it, and then with your infrared, you can probably follow it. So that's new technology that maybe will make radio telemetry much less important. But like the thing that I do is I study their vocalizations. So, and also I have some experience with music. So anything that you can learn about recording, whether it's through music or directly through wildlife sounds, that's very, very helpful.
Myron, how can professionals acquire these skills? I mean, it sounds to me like there's a lot of parallels between field ornithology and field primatology for tarsiers, bird ringing, mist netting, that kind of thing. How can professionals acquire these skills?
Yeah, so the related fields are ornithology and the study of bats in the wild. And depending on where you're at, now there are very few places that actually have tarsiers. So, if you live in the Philippines or Indonesia, you can just go out and directly start a project with tarsiers and develop the skills by interning, by helping someone out, volunteering to assist. But if you're from a country that's not a habitat country, you can still develop the skills by working with an ornithologist or by working with somebody who studies bats. Particularly bats would be very helpful because you're doing it at night largely. And also they use some of the same recording tools. Tarsiers are really cool because they were one of the very first primates ever to be showed to use pure ultrasound. So whereas our hearing in the best case only goes up to about 20,000 hertz, and my hearing, I have lucky, I'm lucky to hear well at 10,000 hertz at this stage of my career. But when our ears are young and fresh, we can hear maybe 20,000 hertz. But you're probably aware that bats use ultrasonics and they use them for echolocation and things like that. And so they showed that tarsiers also use pure ultrasonics using frequencies as high as 80,000 hertz up in the range where bats are doing some of their work. But there are things like bat detectors, and they work just as well for tarsiers as they do for bats. So I remember that when I was first starting out, I tried to link up with a bat scientist and I spent as much time talking with her as I could. In the end, I was not able to go out to the field with her, but I sure asked every question that I could. So there you go. Anybody who's working with bats or with birds, but particularly bats, if you can get out there, and bats are all over the world, so you should be able to find someone, and that will really help prepare you.
What are good questions that new entrants can ask at an interview?
Why are you interested in me for this position? And it could be revealing in a number of ways, but one way that will be really revealing is how carefully they read your application materials.
Would you say that it's appropriate for me to point out here that if a person is an intern or a volunteer or a temporary research assistant, um, taking field notes the old-fashioned way, to make sure that the PI, the principal investigator, doesn't walk off with their field notes and not return them?
Yeah, there's two versions of that I'd like to talk about. Well, there's several issues that we should talk about. Number one, should anybody ever be a volunteer that's unpaid? That gets raised because what it does is it creates a paywall that winds up supporting a society that reinvents itself every generation, where those people that were economically advantaged in the last generation produce people that are advantaged in this generation. I mean, who can work for no pay? So there's the first thing, is should anybody be an unpaid intern or volunteer? The second thing comes into whether or not faculty will take the research of students and volunteers and not properly credit them in the scientific process. That definitely happens. It's happened to me. And, people have outright asked, could I just use your graduate student proposal for my publication here and I'll give you an acknowledgement? Well, when they have a certain amount of authority over you, what do you say? No, that's unethical. It doesn't work, right? And so you need a whole social skill set that I didn't always necessarily have. And so there were things that of mine that, got away without me getting my name on it properly. But I'd say that there's also, and this is really important to mention, there's also the case that students do not always properly acknowledge the credit that their sponsor, that their mentor put in. And so I've had students who work under my mentorship and use my field sites and use my contacts. And then as soon as they're, almost done, they declare independence and run off with the data. So I had to start a new thing and say that while it would be clearly unethical for me to use your data without properly crediting you, it's also unethical for a student to do a project that's basically a carve out of their mentors. And let me back up and say that there are at least, again, a spectrum. There's at least two ways to do it. Sometimes a student like myself picks something so wild that it's unrelated to what their mentor does. And I had one of those too when I was in Singapore. A student wanted to do the slow loris there. I didn't have much time or much. If he wants to publish something on his own based on those notes, that's fine. But if I bring you to my prime field site and I give you the research question and I introduce you to all of your contacts, who your counterparts are, you're using my whole research establishment that's been set up after decades, and then you suddenly declare independence and run away with the data, then that's not ethical either. So when I'm really giving away a part of my research program to a student, I now have to be very careful to make sure that there's something understood in writing beforehand, that you either produce this and you publish on it, or after a certain amount of time, the data reverts back to my lab, not gets sold off to some other lab, which, believe me, that sort of thing happens.
Where do our knowledge gaps in tarsier biology lie?
Not well, it's huge. I mean, when I started, we had no idea really how many species there were and where they were. And that was the question that was really proposed to me. I was in the just about finishing up my PhD, and I got invited. I got this email in December 1999, and it said, primate taxonomy for the new millennium workshop. 25 of the world's top primate taxonomists are invited to Orlando, Florida to develop a comprehensive taxonomic list of primates. And I thought to myself, well, this is all interesting, but it seems like I'm invited to it. And as far as I know, I'm not a taxonomist, and I'm not the world's top 25 of anything in the whole world. But for this, I was being invited to it. And what the goal was, in fact, it was this book here, right? This one right here, Primate Taxonomy by Colin Groves, the publication of that really spurred that workshop. And the sort of the program, the agenda that was laid out to us by Russell Mittermeier, a real giant within conservation, was find out how many species, how many taxa there are in the group that you're an expert in, find out where they are, where they live. And if you're something like a chimpanzee biologist, where you've got probably 100 trained PhDs for each possible taxon, they had a little bit of work to do. But where for tarsiers, where just on Sulawesi, we've gone from 1 to over 16 taxa, the gaps have been huge. So I wound up spending virtually my whole career. Here I am. My very first grant proposal said I'll go to Sulawesi and determine how many species there were. And one of the reviewers said, Shekelle has laid out a career's worth of work. And now here I am at the sort of on the backside of my career looking back. And sure enough, I'm just getting to the point now where I'm starting to send out publications that encapsulate it all. And additionally, how it has affected our understanding of conservation priorities in the region. So it's not just doing work on tarsiers, because tarsiers can get research funding that banana slugs can't. And, we could do the same project on banana slugs, but it would be very hard to get the same amount of funding and interest. And so it's a privileged situation to have that kind of a research subject. And so the goal should be that the research results are broadly applicable to everything else, including those taxa that aren't likely to get much research funding or even interest.
Myron, can you suggest a research topic for a wildlife biology student watching this?
Well, so first thing is, are you a big pond sort of person or a little pond sort of person? And the big pond is chimpanzees, gorillas, orangutans. And then the questions must be much, much narrower. But there are a number of little pond taxa, like tarsiers, like lorises, where you can walk in with the question as basic: how many species are there and where are they located? And it's a wonderful research project to take on, because it's wide open. Even now, we still know so little. I mean, have we done even something as basic as a basic study of diet of each species? No, not even close. Not even close. So if it's tarsiers, your question can be almost anything, because we haven't done it, or we haven't done it on one of the other species that's been less studied. You want to know, here's an interesting right now. You go into the southern end of Sulawesi, and there's a lot of limestone karst. And limestone karst is like Swiss cheese. and it gets lots of holes in it. Well, the tarsiers like to nest in those holes, little caves, essentially. They're little tarsier-sized caves, and they love that. They've never really been studied much there. I know I was sent there to do some work, and I found that tarsiers were living. If they imagine how hard they were to trap, I put my net over this hole, and they come out a different hole. But when I found where they were sleeping, I looked down there and lots of little bat bones and other things like that. So, a little bat coming into one of those caves would probably get smacked by a tarsier quite quickly and eaten.
Myron, are there any books on tarsiers?
Well, I have three sitting there right there. That's the one by an edited volume by Karsten Niemietz, Biology of Tarsiers. These are all for scientists. And this is Sharon Gursky's book, The Spectral Tarsier. Um, and that's a monograph on her, at this point, 30 years of research on tarsier behavior, mostly at one field site, Tankoko, but a few others. And then finally, another edited volume there, Tarsiers Past, Present, and Future. So there's a few books that are specialized for scientists, but there's really nothing for a popular audience. Like up here is Jane Goodall's Chimpanzees of Gombe, which maybe popular audience might be able to enjoy. There's nothing like that for tarsiers yet.
Are there any conferences that students can attend on tarsiers?
There's an international international primatological society, but each country tends to have one too. So the United States has one, Britain has one, and those would be great places for students to go to listen and learn. And I'm sure that you'll walk away with a tremendous amount of information, contacts. That would really be a first step.
What should people wear for an interview?
I'm a field biologist, and so I wear this is like insect shield clothes. I don't like to be bit by mosquitoes, and I just pull the stuff off of my shelf. So I don't really have a good one about what to wear. I would say be yourself.
Myron, is there anything you'd like to add?
Well, sure. So let's talk about perhaps misconceptions and pseudoscience that hamper my work. So one thing that's really important is that tarsiers and conservation, the role is to act as a mascot, a tourism mascot, to act as a flagship species. A flagship species is like a panda. It's supposed to attract attention and funding. And then also an umbrella species. An umbrella species, if we designate a conservation area for the umbrella species, it protects everything else underneath it. So tarsiers are really supposed to do those three things. And there are many people who just simply won't believe that a tarsier can be a flagship species. It has to be big. It has to be an elephant, a tiger, an orangutan. And that has been something that's been difficult in a country like Indonesia, which has elephants, tigers, and orangutans, but not so much in the Philippines where they don't have that. So in the Philippines, there's places where tarsiers are like Mickey Mouse at Disneyland, and you can't walk into a convenience store without seeing tarsier keychains and tarsier backpacks and stuff like that. So that's one of the misconceptions is that with, a wealth of riches, why wouldn't you pick something better than a tarsier? Well, the country, the Philippines, works just fine. And Sulawesi, there aren't pandas, there aren't elephants, there aren't tigers, there aren't orangutans. So we've got to pick what Sulawesi has, which are things like tarsiers and its monkeys and the babirusa that we talked about earlier and a few others. So that's one really for a misconception that is important to address to decision makers over things like permitting and stuff like that. They get a lot of people coming in saying they want to work with an orangutan, and one comes in and says they want to work with a tarsier. So convincing them that I'm worth their time and that tarsiers are worth their time, that has been more of an uphill struggle than you might think, and it certainly isn't in a country like the Philippines. The other thing is that once I get out into the field, I'm actually working. So, social skills are really important too. I guess I glossed over that. But in my work, I found myself interacting with people who went everywhere from government ministers in Jakarta to farmers in Sulawesi. And when it comes to things like the misperceptions that I needed to deal with, the ministers there was this issue that was very challenging, which is that they saw it very difficult to see tarsiers as a flagship species, as a species that can attract interest, because typically they're going to be, pardon me, they're going to be in meetings with people who want to study orangutans, elephants, tigers, classic flagship species. In the Philippines, it's not an issue because they don't have those big megafauna, charismatic fauna, so the tarsier is quite natural, and it's like Mickey Mouse at Disneyland, where you can't walk into a convenience store in some places without seeing tarsier key rings and tarsier backpacks and tarsier t-shirts. So that was one set of misconceptions that I had to develop a bunch of strategies and skills for how to show that tarsiers really are effective on the island of Sulawesi, where there is no megafauna, there aren't elephants, there aren't orangutans, etc. With the farmer, this one was really interesting because everywhere that I went, I encountered farmers who would tell me that tarsiers eat whatever crop it is they happen to grow. And so, but they're probably eating the pests that prey on the coconut crop. And there you have to step really carefully, because most times when I go in with my university learning and a local person tells me something, it's far more likely that that local person is actually correct than the book learning that I got in the United States about something in Indonesia. But in this one case, it's pretty clear that they've picked up a false belief, and it can be very difficult, very challenging. And so developing the social skills to walk in and to be humble enough to realize that my book learning isn't right about a lot of things, and their knowledge is usually better, but on this one, it's really not. It's a big challenge for sure.
Any other advice for somebody who wants to embark on a career as a field biologist specializing in tarsiers?
Absolutely, and there's no substitute for experience. You know, the first time I walk in and a farmer tells me that a tarsier eats his crop, I know that this it's biologically impossible. But to develop the skills to explain to a farmer, learn about what colonialist scientist means and learn what parachute science means, because traditionally these have been very common. And the idea is that I could come from a university in the United States, go over to the Indonesia with all the money that I have, and then work out a deal and work with some local people for some period of time, a few weeks, a few months, and then take the data and fly back home. That's called parachute science. And all of the asymmetries of colonialism are still there. And so nowadays, while you could still probably do that, it's really frowned upon. And the Indonesians might, be much more careful in weeding you out. So developing the experience to get the skills that you're going to need. The advice for new scientists is learn what a colonialist science means, and what decolonizing science means, and learn what parachute science is. And these words might, they might trigger some sort of a reaction, and you don't get focused on the words. Think about what they're addressing. There were colonialist imbalances in the structure, and are we still maintaining that today? Are we treating our colleagues in habitat countries as true partners, or even the leader of the project? Let me give you an example here. Suppose it was reversed, and suppose that in the United States, in some rural area of the United States, rural Wyoming or rural Alabama or something, some scientists, it happened that there was a valuable place, and scientists from every country you can think of, China and Iran and Brazil, they were all descending on this little area in Wyoming or Alabama, and with all of their strange customs, the strange food that they wanted to eat. And in order to, meet the laws, their local representation to show that they had some local connection was a graduate student from New York City and a government official from Washington, D.C. And so you've got the government official from Washington, D.C., the graduate student from New York City, and the scientists from China and Iran showing up in Wyoming and explaining to them why what they're doing is wrong and their local knowledge is all wrong. And worse, it's not good for conservation. How well are you going to be received there? So that's what I was trying to get at. And there's no substitute for experience. You're going to make mistakes. But if you can try to be humble and learn what these latest trends are in science, you'll do yourself a lot of favors.
Myron, sadly, we have to draw a line under that, but it's been an absolute privilege talking to you. Myron, you are a senior instructor at the Western Washington University. Thank you so much for being on the Practical Animal Channel, Dr. Myron Shekelle.
Thank you very much, John. It's been a pleasure to be here.